All right, I'd like to talk a little bit about the dangers of preaching and blaming the Jews. And some of this comes from a book called Preaching the Gospels Without Blaming the Jews. I want to start by talking a little bit about the anti-Semitism that has been in the church since its beginnings, actually. A couple examples, we have John Chrysostom from the 4th century. He actually wrote 8 homilies against the Jews, in which he, among other things, calls the Jews dogs, and argues that they are no longer the people of God because Christians have now taken over that position. Much later, of course, we get Martin Luther. He wrote a tract on the Jews and their lies, and in that he says, God has struck the Jews with madness and blindness and confusion of mind, so we are even at fault in not avenging all this innocent blood of our Lord, and of the Christians which they shed for 300 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the blood of the children they have shed since then, which still shines forth from their eyes and their skin. We are at fault for not slaying them. Rather, we allow them to live freely in our midst, despite all their murdering, cursing, blaspheming, lying, and defaming. And Martin Luther continues by suggesting that Christians set fire to synagogues or schools and bury whatever will not burn, raze their houses, take their prayer books and Talmudic writings, threaten the lives of their rabbis who continue to teach, ban them from the highways, and confiscate their money. Note that we have no evidence that Jews shed any Christian blood for 300 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, or killed children since then. More recently, Edwin Hoskins wrote a commentary on the Fourth Gospel in 1947. And in that he says, throughout the narrative, so the narrative of the Fourth Gospel, also there runs the conviction of the author that whereas the Jews were the instruments of the prince of the darkness of this world, Pilate was the unconscious agent in the divine purpose of God for the salvation of the world, and that his authority over Jesus was therefore given him from above. This conviction is due in part, no doubt, to the desire to remove the blame for the crucifixion as far as possible from the imperial authorities and to fix it firmly upon the Jewish authorities, but much more to the perception that Jesus must have been lifted up in his death in order that he might draw all men unto him. This idea of blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus has been a deep thread throughout church history. And of course, what happened in Germany in the 1940s in some ways was a result of that, or at least it was able to use that anti-Semitism in the church in the Holocaust. So, for example, Gushi in The Righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust says, when the Nazis set to work annihilating Jews, they found a deep reservoir of scorn for Jews on which to draw. Ever since the Holocaust, ever since World War II, Christian scholars have been working to make sure that Christian theology no longer contains any elements that anyone can in the future come along and use to justify such an atrocity. And so I want to make us aware of some of the roots of anti-Semitism that sometimes is expressed in our preaching. So the first thing to remember is that Jesus was a Jew. We note in the Gospels, Mark 6:56 is one example, that he wore fringes on his clothes. Fringes on their clothes is what the Pharisees did, what all Jews who were faithful to God did, based on Numbers 15 and Deuteronomy 22. Another thing that Jesus did was he sat to teach. Sitting to teach was a specifically Jewish method of teaching, and we see that referenced in Matthew 23:2 as well. So remembering that Jesus was a Jew can help us to not include anti-Semitism in our preaching. Second thing to remember is that Rome was the oppressor and not the Jews. At the time that Jesus was walking on this earth, Rome had taken over the country of Palestine, and the Jews were suffering under the rule of Rome. And so it's not that Jews were oppressing Christians, but rather that Rome was persecuting later Christians, as well as making the Jews suffer during the time of Jesus. The next thing to think about is the Jewish groups mentioned in the Gospels. They are generally mentioned negatively, but we have to remember that the Jews that the Gospel writers were talking about were specific Jews from specific groups. We have to be careful and not make them the bad guys in the story. So the scribes, for example, which the word scribe is often translated in our Gospels as teachers of the law, they were not all bad. Ezra was a scribe. Nehemiah mentions another person who was a scribe. Matthew 13:52 shows that some scribes were disciples of Jesus. And Galatians 6:11 shows that Paul used scribes. Scribes were simply people who could read and write, and they were involved in a lot of tasks in those days, and they weren't all bad. Second of all, priests were not all bad. We see that Zechariah, for instance, was a priest. And so we have to recognize that when the Gospels talk about the priests and make blanket statements, like any blanket statement against a group of people, it's not necessarily true of each individual in that group. And finally, Pharisees were not all bad. We are used to thinking of the Pharisees as the bad guys, but we see in John 3:1 that Nicodemus came to Jesus. Philippians 3:5 reminds us that Paul was a Pharisee. And we saw earlier that Jesus wore the tassels just like the Pharisees did. The Pharisees were concerned about purity. They wanted people to be closer to God by following the purity laws that the priests followed. So, in a sense, they were the first ones to teach the priesthood of all believers, which is definitely a New Testament concept. So, we have to make sure that we don't make the Pharisees always and think of them all as the bad guys. Part of this is because when we begin to think of all of these groups of Jews as the bad guys, we then can't help but develop an attitude that sees today's Jews as the bad guys, especially if we don't happen to know any Jews in real life. So watch your preaching for the kinds of statements that might encourage anti-Semitism in your congregations. Next, the Jews and legalism. We are often used to talking about Jews and Judaism as a legalistic religion, but we have to recognize, and if you watch the video that I've also linked in this week, you will have seen that Jews are saved by God's grace. Look at Deuteronomy 7. God chose the Jews out of all the people, and it wasn't because of anything they did. So they are saved by God's grace in the same way that Christians are. And what we call the law is perhaps better understood as a way of life. The word Torah doesn't mean law in the sense of a legalistic religion, but rather a way of life. God gave them the Torah, in their understanding, as a loving way to live as God's people. And so they follow it in the same with the same attitude that we have when we follow the teachings of the New Testament, the teachings to work for grace and for love, and the teachings to forgive, and all of those teachings that are in the New Testament. Those are a way of life for us as well. Also, we need to recognize that Jesus seems to have been aware of Judaism's oral traditions. Those oral traditions were later written down in texts like the Mishnah. And when we look at the Mishnah, we find that many of Jesus's sayings echoed the Jewish teachings of his day. A book like the one that I took this from can help you make those connections. So I hope this has been helpful as you think about the Jews, our roots as Christians in Judaism, and how we can value God's people in a broader sense than simply the Christian tradition in opposition to Judaism.